Hello, I'm Adrian Goldsworthy, and this is the Break It Down Show.
Yes, it is. Adrian Goldsworthy is a force of knowledge of the ancient world, in particular the Roman times, and I can't wait to talk to you. Look, we're all fascinated by the Romans, and we spend a lot of time doing it. The main reason why you're here, let's hold the book up real fast here. He's got this new book called The Fort. It's one of a series of books. Listen, he writes a lot of fiction and he writes a lot of history. And so you're getting the benefit of a PhD historian who knows this time writing these fiction books. And it's just a treat to read something like this. So thank you for sending me the book. Thank you for telling me the story. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Very happy to be invited. It's, basically, I think like most authors, I write the sort of books I'd like to read. So you just hope that someone out there likes them as well, because it's a book that you'd like to be there and isn't. So you've got to write it.
Yeah, and we're stuck with fiction because though we know a lot about a lot of different battles and everything, it's just look. So I'm a combat veteran, and a lot of the stories that are worth telling are the things that happen when we're not getting shot at. Getting through the day, trying to understand something, or just what's that? Oh, it's nothing. It's just people walking by. Yeah. Okay, are you sure? And then you just don't know. There's so much of that intrigue that happens. And we just don't have those histories. I mean, sure, there's some journals and that kind of thing out there, but for the most part, the people in Rome, the people in the Roman legions, they didn't get to write a lot of memoirs and biographies back then.
Well, they wrote them. It's just they haven't survived. We've got a tiny, tiny fraction of 1% of the literature of the ancient world. And when you think, the story that started all this series of novels off is based on writing tablets from Vindolanda, where you have these letters written. And as many people point out, it's the sort of stuff that comes across any commanding officer's desk or any manager's desk every day. It's the dull stuff. It's not the dramatic events, the famous battles. It's all, can I go on leave? Where's this unit? How many people are where? What are they doing? How many are on sick call? All the, normal stuff. And then people writing to their friends or buying things. So you get these glimpses of what was there. And these people had very rich lives. And if you're in the Roman army, you were signed up for 25 years. The odds are you did a lot of waiting around like any soldier. But there are aspects where there's a duty roster from a legion in Egypt in the 1st century that you could put up in a barrack room today. And it's basically the fatigues listed for that century of what you're doing over the next month. And it's presented in a way that's familiar. It's not so very different. You can imagine these guys moaning at it and looking and sort of saying, oh, yeah, it's...
It really is. It always comes down to logistics. You get sent off as a Roman, as a commander, the further out you are, probably the less experienced you are. You have to prove yourself. So they're going to put you in a situation where there's not a lot of resources. And the God's honest truth is if 1,000 dedicated people come to your position with the intent of overtaking it and killing you, you're dead.
Exactly.
That isn't different in Afghanistan. That wasn't different in Rome or wherever part of the outlying area.
And there might be the other 99% of the army is somewhere quite safe at that same time because the luck was with them or with you. And it's that, you look at these frontier systems and all these forts, and a lot of it was probably incredibly dull and quiet most of the time. And then now and again, something happens. And as you say, you can only send a message as fast as somebody can gallop a horse and carry it. And then people can only come to support you by the time they've got organized, by the time they've got sorted out. It's all quite slow. This even comparatively short distances, as we would see them, you're a long way from help. You're a long way from any support. So it's trying to give that sense of isolation, but also you could walk into a base in Dacia, which is modern-day Romania, one in northern Britain, Roman army base, and there'd be enough that would be very familiar. You'd look around, the way things were laid out, the way things were organized, apart from the structure of everything. So it's sort of one big army, but it's spanning this incredibly large empire with very different climates, cultures, all the things you're doing. And yet there is a link. There's sort of, there is some control there. But on the other hand, when it comes down to it, you might be the one who's out there where, it's all happening. So...
there's a lot that goes into that. I mean, if you're a lieutenant, and I'll just use modern times because it's shocking how often we look at something from Roman times or even Sumerian time, and you're like, that's the exact same thing. Like, really not much different at all. And we think we know history, and I want to get into this later on, like what we think we know of Roman history, et cetera, and how we apply it in modern times. You know, it's paper thin, like all things like that are like this. But if you take a platoon, which is, for the sake of argument, let's say that's 50 people that are out there trying to survive on the side of a mountain in Afghanistan, and you walk a patrol, which is less than a platoon, and you walk them out 2 miles away, they're 45 minutes into the future. And so whatever comes and hits them, there is no help coming for at least 45 minutes. And when that help gets there, it can't be so breathless that it can't engage. Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and so, okay, maybe a helicopter is there, but probably not. That's because you're way the heck out. So it's called economy of force. And so you're forced as a lieutenant, as a very junior commander, to be a political animal early on, because you have to work with this community to survive. And you can't let ego and your ability to impose will cause you to not to die, you know, because it's dangerous, and that has always been true for these guys in these outlying forts.
And the decisions made by somebody who's, you know, not getting paid a lot, really, by the standards of the whole army, make a huge difference in your relations to the local peoples, because as far as they're concerned, you are the Roman Empire, or, you know, you were the British Empire on the northwest frontier of India 100 years ago, and more recently you're NATO, you're the US Army there. There isn't anyone else. And it's that I've always seen these, particularly the Vindolanda stories that came as, in a sense, almost as Westerns, but they're very much frontier stories. They are that on the edge. They're where, yes, you're technically part of the Roman Empire, but what does that really mean? And try to suggest that you've got these very mixed, you know, the army is recruited from half the population of the empire, and most of them are not Roman, as we would understand it. And even if you are Roman, you might never have seen Rome or Italy. You might just, you know, it might just be your status. So you put all these people together and then you send them out, and then and it can, you know, you've only got to look at some of the, some incidents, say with the Plains Indians or Plains tribes in the 19th century, how sometimes you get the last person you would want is the one on the spot doing the negotiation, and everybody else has to carry the can for that. But that's how it plays out. That's who's there. And sometimes you get the right person as well, who can make things happen in a way that's completely different. So much depends on that personality and that character. And yet we're looking at this as great. Yeah, beg pardon?
Do you play dominoes?
Not for a long time. Used to, but
it reminds. So here's the thing that happens, and I know this has to happen. So you go out there and you're doing your tour in wherever you're at, you know, Romania. By the way, I used to know a Romanian colonel named Colonel Roman. So he was Roman the Romanian. That was kind of fun. We always enjoyed that.
Easy to remember,
right. And he looked very Roman, by the way.
Well, they do. They're proud of the fact they're descended from the Romans, as far as they're concerned. Whether it's true or not, maybe. But Romanian is a Latin language. You know, it's there in the middle of Europe, where all the others around it are not, and they're speaking this. So
So when you're there and you do your tour out at that fort, at some point you leave, and then whatever mistakes you took, they leave with you in your perception. But the reality is the next commander is holding that can that you talked about. And so those offenses are still given, and you don't even know they exist. And I've seen this a lot with commanders who come in, and they don't realize that there's this thorn in their side that their peer did, and their peer would never know that they did it either, because it's so hard to work cross-culturally, cross-language in an area where, you know, you're trying to do something, they're trying to do something, and those things don't always jive. You know, that's like, and so you can do a lot of damage to your own well-being, or just create discontent. And again, you're so exposed out in these forts, outlying areas, you want to sow contentment, but not so much that you're not doing your job. It's a real tough balance.
It's and particularly when they're an oral culture, even things that happened generations ago, they were what my grandfather told me. So the person remembers it as perhaps a more immediate thing than we do sometimes when you've read it in a book or a newspaper. You know, so these old arguments basically can still live on, and you don't know, and that's I mean, one thing the Romans did, they tended, as far as we can tell, and there are lots of problems, you get the impression a lot of people stayed for quite a long time in a region, so could develop that. But that can be both good and bad, because obviously if they get to dislike you, then that's sticking as well. But on the other hand, you have a chance, or at least some people can, but if you can be bothered, and not everybody is willing to try and learn how things work and see it from the other point of view, but not go native in a sense, and not turn around completely, as you say, still do your job, but understand it, try and do it in a way that's going to work there rather than on paper somewhere else.
How does that work, though? I mean, I know in the American Army, we struggle with the cultural thing. The moment you go native, someone else decides it for you. You know, I'm really good at going native and getting in and building trust. But I'm also understand that I have to constantly, and I look at everything like an equation, right? Like if the American side is too dominant, then this side will recede, and you can't, it's harder to line them up, right? So I'm always trying to teach commanders to balance things out and to reduce their dominance. And I have to do that by going partly native, but I also have to go native with the American side and make the other reality at least palatable, possibly understandable. You know, so what did the Romans do to teach their people how to do this?
I mean, the Romans are quite good at it, but then they do have a lot of practice. It's one of the things before I started writing these novels, I read a non-fiction book called Pax Romana that was trying to look at just what does it mean when the Roman Empire arrives and how to react. And the striking thing is, which again you see parallels in the modern world, is that everywhere you arrive, there's already history, a lot of competition. There's the local culture. You've got local leaders, many of whom are vying with each other for dominance, different groups that are trying to dominate. And there's nearly always someone who sees you, the new arrival, as an opportunity. They're big, they're strong. If I get them on my side, it'll help my cause. And there are others who, as soon as someone's done that, well, because my enemy has done that, I need now to find somebody else to match the Roman. And, you know, there are some areas of the Roman Empire where the Romans arrive and they conquer and no one ever fights them because they've decided it's actually better to be friends to the Romans. And on the whole, Roman rule is quite sort of laid back. They don't want much from the provinces. I mean, they'll tax you, but and there are cases where it goes horribly wrong. But there's a sense, because at the highest level, you know, the Roman commanders, the senatorial class that are commanding the provinces, commanding the legions, they're only ever in a post for a couple of years at most, and then they go off to another career that might be a civilian post. It's much harder to tell how many of the people are there longer. There's the character Ferox, who's the sort of the main hero of the story. I have him in the early books. He's a centurion regionarius, the regional centurion. And we hear a bit about these guys in that they crop up, people list as their title, they're mentioned at Vindolanda, they crop up in Britain, they crop up in Egypt. So we suspect it's fairly universal. And we hear in some sources that they're sitting in on meetings of tribal councils. You know, when the chiefs gather or when there's a festival, they're there, they're sitting, they're talking. And you get the impression they're trying to build up. So there's a sort of political, diplomatic aspect to it. But they're also the Roman authority as well. So people, you know, they know that that's what they see when anyone's looking at them. So while they might be trusted, there's also the element of what do I want the Romans to do or not to do? The problem always is that getting down to that level in the Roman period, you have glimpses of it. You know, you get little hints, this is what's going on. But no one at that level's written an account that has survived telling us about it. So the novels are really an attempt for me to try and think of how it might have been. And inevitably, I've drawn on other periods that we know more about. And just a sense of trying to create a world that could have been real. And I can't guarantee 100% or anything like that this is what it was really like, but something that's workable, some sort of sense. And even in, you know, the other books that, as far as the Romans are concerned, you know, they talk about the Britons. All the people on this island are the same. But that, as far as we can tell, is not the way anyone local would think, because you belong to your tribe, to your clan, to your particular family, down to these different groups. And the concept of being a Briton or a Gaul is completely alien to you. And you might, after a few generations of Roman rule, you might start to think that way. But trying to suggest that, and very clearly, a lot of Roman senior officers are not going to be able to understand this. You know, it's quite rare for them to learn a language other than Greek. There are a few exceptions of men who learn the local language, but you sort of feel lower down, people have got to be doing this. But again, it's the hints and the guesses rather than I may have made my Romans a bit too nice, a bit too modern in some respects, but I've tried to hint that now and again there is the going into a village, burning it down, and enslaving the population. You know, that's how the Roman Empire works.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
they were very practical, so they didn't. You know, they don't want a rebellion. They don't want. It's expensive. No government wants to spend money and station these troops there, and yet northern Britain, say, has a wildly disproportionate number of soldiers in it over centuries. And that's always a problem for the Romans, because not only is it expensive, but when you've got people who might decide to make themselves emperor, you don't want to present them with a large concentration of soldiers who might think, yeah, that's a good idea, and back them. So it's dangerous in a way that isn't really true today. So there's something going on, but the literary sources we have, you know, we have something like 6-7 mentions of Hadrian's Wall. That's it. And none of them really tell us anything about it or what it was for. So you know, archaeology will tell you about the long-term trends, the patterns, what they're building, some idea. But, you know, sometimes you'll find a Roman little fortlet or a tower with a stockade around it next to a little village or a farm. And what you can't get at is this like the police station that actually reassures you and makes you feel safe? Or is this the hostile force that's, you know, staring down your throat all the time? And you resent, because the archaeology just isn't going to tell you that. All you can see is that these people are living cheek by jowl for a long time, but we just don't know.
The lack of knowledge on these things, it is incredible. And I think you're doing right by looking at current things, because when I was reading the book, and again, a lot of parallels between, in particular, Afghanistan, just because you can be so remote and you are trying to work with the local villagers. And sometimes to survive, you have to put a whipping on somebody so that everybody knows that, like, no, these guys aren't messing around. You know, as long as we're nice, we'll all get along okay, which is an atrocity. But then again, it's just trying to prevent a different atrocity.
Yes,
so
exactly.
It's interesting. So a guy like Ferox, who travels around in this, you know, in your story, like he's in Britain and now he's over in Romania. What is a dude like that? Like when you get your orders to go, I don't know, what is that, 1,000 miles away to a whole new world, whole new land? Yeah, like what is that like for someone like that in that day? Or can you even guess?
It is down to guessing, because we see, you know, we often, much of the information we have about centurions, of officers of that grade, comes from when they've set up an inscription recording their career. And it's often a tombstone or a monument set up by the family, and it lists. And some people, you know, there are men who served in 12, 13 legions dotted all around the empire. Now, we can't be 100% sure that they physically go to those places. And this isn't just a jump in rank or status, but that you're actually, because we know a lot of officers are detached. They're at headquarters, they're doing all sorts of jobs. You know, you get one fellow who's in Byzantium controlling the traffic and regulating things through that. There's one Vindolanda tablet has a strength report of an auxiliary cohort, and out of the 6 centurions, only 1 is at the base, 2 are within a day or so's journey, but the other 3 are in the south of the province. So someone has had to step up from the grade below to do their job, presumably. But also, so there's so many things that the Romans knew without having to explain. So they never bothered to quite explain to us at any point. I mean, it was interesting, a couple of summers ago, before all the coronavirus was, I took a few historians of the Napoleonic era who were both one ex-Royal Navy, one ex-US Army, around Caelian, a Roman army fortress where there's remains not far from where I live, with, you know, you've got an amphitheatre, you've got barrack blocks. And they're both specialists on the Duke of Wellington's army in that era. And they said there's so much they don't know because nobody ever wrote it down. That just the way particular regiments did things, the way the army organized things, every now and again something turns up and thinks, oh, shows that they're doing that. Now, it was a perfectly logical thing to do, but often you assume it hasn't happened that early. Or we're being too modern, you know, we're just assuming they're basically a 21st century army, even though they're not. So at least with that society of 200 years ago, we've got far more connection to jump back 2,000 years and then think of not just what's the logical way we would do something like that. Because mostly, you know, they're practical problems very often, but how would the Romans in Roman society? You know, we know that the next grade up, the equestrians, the sort of the social class below the Senate, who provide a lot of officers, they seem to move around. Our guess is they do about 3 years in a job, The Vindolanda tablets showed us that at a base like that, the commander comes along, but he also brings his family. And that's wife, children, slaves, freedmen, hunting dogs, horses, because basically the house he occupies that's built for him in this, although it's built of timber, it's a decent-sized house in Pompeii. And it's there in this base. And later on, it's even though this is northern Britain, they'll build it around a central courtyard to keep the hot sun off you, which northern Britain isn't a problem that often. So all these people are sort of, traveling around. The whole family's got to do. They've got to put everything in the carts. They've got to travel in carriages. So it's happening. But apart from a glimpse, there's a marvelous letter from Egypt where a centurion writes to his wife and basically gives a long list of things she's got to bring him. And one of it's, his spare shield and all this. So you have this image of this poor woman sort of laden down with a great heap of baggage on her head. But it's probably the woman and the slaves. But one of the warnings is when you're on the ferry boat, don't show off your jewelry. It's not safe. So even some of these, the army doesn't really take much formal responsibility for even officers' wives. And the soldiers are by law not supposed to marry, but they clearly do. And some of them probably have more of their family with them because, again, they're in the army 25 years. And the army winks at this because any of the boys that come from these liaisons tend to be good material potential recruits. So a lot of people are born in castries, they're listed as, in the camp. And they tend to do quite well because, they grow up knowing the system. So it's one of those things. But basically the state is saying, I'm not going to pay for you. I'm not going to organize your transport. I'm not going to give you a pension. I'm not going to give you rations. Your husband can take all of this out of his salary if he wants to, and we won't stop him. But that's how it is. It's one of those sort of penny pinching things at the top.
When you look at that part of it, the pension and how about the years? I mean, how young are you when you first enter and doing 25 years of service? I mean, that's a career. And if you start when you're 20, when you're 45, of course, people lived to be 37 back then. Yeah. So how long of a career is this? When does it start? And then when you retire after 25 years, is it retired or are you on to the next thing?
Well, it's supposed to be 20 years of sort of full service, then 5 years as a veteran where you're not obliged to do fatigues, you're exempted a few other things. But it's, again, things don't always work that way. And part of the idea in the book is that when you formed a legion, by the time you were about 20 odd years into its formation, you'd have a lot of people who were all coming to that stage, far more than you normally would from normal recruitment. And there's a few sort of hints of this, that there were these blips where, so what do you do with them? And there are complaints earlier on of people not getting their discharge because there was always an excuse, well, sorry, the war's still on, we need you. There was also in the small print, many legions seem only to have discharged every other year. So some poor blokes had to do 26 years instead of 25 because they joined at the wrong moment. But you're supposed to be 18. There are clearly some joining younger. There are some joining considerably older. And again, that's the pattern. Some centurions stay on well into middle age, but what they're doing, harder to say. So it's a mixture. It's probably a more mature army in a sense than we're used to. You don't have quite such a turnover of your average rifle section or rifle squad that's basically 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, that sort of thing. But there will be there, and it depends. There's more of that spread, and it is one of those situations where it's quite notable on Trajan's column, which is the big monument celebrating these conflicts. When you represent the ideal legionary, he's a sort of thick-set, bearded guy. So it isn't the dashing young warrior. It's the idea of this sort of maturity and strength. Again, you look at a lot of those 19th century pictures of whether it's British Army or US Army, and they've all got these great beards out here. But there's that sense of sort of age, strength, maturity, rather than perhaps youthfulness that we'd associate now. And clearly a lot of people will go through, one of the things that's hard to estimate is just how many are coming in who are literate. The army runs on paperwork. It just, it produces, it records everything, it duplicates, triplicates, even you get 4 copies sometimes of and these are files that are clearly being used. So all of that's there archaeologically, and a lot of people we know, there's a letter from Egypt where recruits just joined and he's got a clerk's job straight away. So he's saying, while my mates are out breaking rocks in the quarry, I'm sitting in the nice, comfortable studio. So, but there's a little bit of evidence, which I've gone with in some of the stories, suggesting the army's actually teaching people to read, because presumably, particularly from some of the provinces where there's no tradition of literacy at all, then they're not going to come. But it's so you need enough people to do this. You've presumably got to train them. So again, it comes back all the time. There's this deep frustration. There's so little written by ordinary soldiers. It's just fragments, odd letters, odd incidents, stories about them, but stories told by people of senatorial class or close to it, who clearly aren't going to quite understand this, and who are often a little bit suspicious and hostile to the ordinary soldier as someone who has to be kept under tight discipline. Otherwise he's causing trouble and all this sort of thing. I'm sure people at all the different grades would see it differently, but we're guessing. I don't think human nature has changed very much over the millennia. So I think that basically when you see the glimpses of that looks just like today, it probably was. But you can't prove it.
When you think about things that look like today, we have some advantages in that we don't have to do things in triplicate or quadruplicate, or if we do, it's automatic.
Yeah.
When you get paid, it goes directly into your bank account. You can access it anywhere. It's all virtual money for the most part. But in this case, these guys have to have money. And then from my experience, when you're deployed, the military doesn't want you spending all of your money in town. Some, sure, but you don't want to tear up the local economy with all of this, gold and then devalue it. And then, oh my gosh, you have problems like crazy. So how did they deal with problems like that? And how does someone, as you amass wealth, it's in your sock. I didn't even try, and I had a giant sock full of cash and coins, right? It was probably $700 in there, and that's easy to do. And I wasn't even getting paid I was getting paid in, electronic money, and it would convert into script and coins no matter what I did. So what did those guys do about these kind of, 25 years? They're like, hey, I'm going to bring all of my money with me on this trail,
Well, the army does have its banking system, and every fort has, unless it's in a really waterlogged area, underneath the Shrine of the Standards in the headquarters building, there's an underground strong room, because you're physically storing a lot of coin. But the signifer, the standard bearer in every century, is the man also responsible for keeping the pay records. So you are supposed to be paid, by the time of the stories, 4 times a year, and it's all documented, and a lot of it, you're supposedly paid 75 denarii every quarter, but then you've got deductions for uniform, for food, for equipment, there's a long list, the burial club, all these sorts of things. We've got some of these. So in theory, one of the emperors stops 2 legions from ever camping together because he was a bit worried that their treasuries would have enough money concentrated there to allow the local governor to make a bid for the imperial throne. There's enough cash to start you going. So a lot of it is physically there, and you notice very quickly when any army unit stops for even a few days, people are outside the camp to sell them things. And there are lots of traders who follow them around. And there's one case of Caesar mentions in Gaul that one of his camps in the Belgic tribal areas is attacked, and there wasn't even time for the merchants to get inside. So they're there in, a really dodgy area right from the start. And you can see it as well. One of the ways you can trace it archaeologically, you can see all the sherds from the pottery, the wine that's coming in, the sauces that are coming in. Those are visible because pottery, basically it breaks, but it stays there. Whereas the wooden barrels generally have rotted away. We sometimes see that. A lot of the other stuff that's come in other containers. So the army it's the biggest group of people that's paid in hard cash in the Roman Empire. So it does have a big effect on the economy. But generally, the Romans actually see this as positive in the sense that it encourages the towns in the area and the cities to develop into something that they see as more Roman. So particularly in the West, where maybe people haven't lived like that, suddenly along the Rhineland in Germany, because you've got all the army there, you'll have what will become cities like Cologne and others that have started as an army base, then the armies move on, then it's become a big civilian settlement. And there's a lot of Vindolanda tablets that are requests for leave passes, we never know whether they got them because we've only got the stubs of what they asked for. And they don't actually say, is this a couple of days past to go to a slightly bigger town that's not too far away, or a few days? Are you going for a few weeks to go to one of the bigger cities in southern Britain? Or is this a couple of months furlough that you can actually go back? Most of the troops stationed there are from what's now Holland. So do you go back home for a season? Because again, you are in the army a long time. So to keep up the goodwill, and also because you want to keep recruiting from these same communities, because there tend to be some areas in particular that provide an awful lot of soldiers, generation after generation, sometimes even to the same unit, but just generally, it's clearly joining the army is seen as a good thing, an honourable thing, or there's so little work there, any of those factors. So you can move stuff on paper. So if you did get posted right to the other end of the empire, you didn't physically have to take a chest with all your money with you. But nevertheless, they carry quite a lot. Yeah. And there are lots of these coin hoards that have discovered somebody buried and never came back for whatever reason. And there's sometimes you find a lot of newly minted stuff that's clearly just been issued as pay.
Interesting. Yeah, I always wonder about the logistics of things. Just they fascinate me. By the way, we're talking to Adrian Goldsworthy. Here's his latest book. It's called The Fort. I've been reading it, and it's a whole big old dash of Roman history with some fiction thrown on top of it, and I love it. There are so many words in here that I'm like, I think these are English words, but they're English because they came to us from Latin. And I was telling you off mic, I had to spend a lot of time in the dictionary. It's one of the things I do if I come across a word that I don't really have a command of. I might know it, quoted finger know it, but if I don't have a command of it, I look it up, and boy, there are so many words in there, and that might sound like it's hard work, everybody. It was a treat to be able to read about these things and really understand what a centurion is, what a legion is, all these different things. And these areas, Vindolanda, whatever. What is that? I don't know what that is. Dacia. What is that? How do you even say it? Is it Dacia, Dacia, Dacia? I don't, so there's a lot of richness in your books. And I appreciate you doing that because it makes the book just that much more engaging for me. It's almost like you've got a Wikipedia entry, sorry for Wikipedia reference, but underneath the book where you've got to go all these rabbit hole things, and it just gives you so much more depth and context. It's really incredible, man.
Well, it's, I've spent my adult life studying the Romans, so I avoided writing fiction about the period for quite a while because I wrote some novels set in the Napoleonic Wars just because it was a break for me. I'm doing non-fiction history the rest of the year, and it was fun. It's always been a hobby, and that's just the time when you start getting lots of letters and diaries, even from people in soldiers in the ranks, let alone from the officers. So you get those little stories. And most of the things in those books, when people would come and say, how on earth did you think of that? I'd actually say, well, that's from so-and-so's diary. This is Lieutenant so-and-so of the 88th, and it really happened. And they really did these things. And some of you don't get that with the Romans. You've got to imagine it in the main. So, and I'm still slightly worried I'll invent something for one of the stories, and in 10 years' time I'll forget I've invented it. So I'll be searching through Tacitus and Suetonius, trying to find some reference to something that just seemed like a good idea when I was sitting there that morning. Yeah. Because it's filling in, as a historian, I always try to be honest and say, there's lots we just don't know. This is where we're guessing, this is what I think, but we don't know. In a novel, somebody can't just open a door, step into nothing. And, well, not this sort of novel anyway. So you've got to try and see, well, how would it actually work? I'd never thought that much about what sort of horses the Roman army's using. Because most skeletal evidence, you can't tell if it's a stallion, a gelding, a mare. But just writing, when I had one of my characters a he, it was much easier if he could be riding a mare, because then I could say she for the horse and just the pronouns are easier. And so I looked up, and then there were various views on this, and then someone had written, oh no, the army just uses stallions. And you look at the size of a horse box where 3 of these things are kept most of the time, and putting 3 stallions in that space would not be a good idea for the health of these animals. So
I'm going to jump in.
It made me ask some questions I'd never have asked otherwise, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is true, though, because, again, Afghanistan, we sent a bunch of Missouri draft mules out there because, these guys need to have draft animals. Those mules ate entirely too much food and weren't built to withstand the altitude, 10,000 feet for these low valley. It didn't work. And then the funniest thing is the military, because the military, God bless us, we love to get things wrong. They're like, well, the next generation will be more adapted. Like, these are mules.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that basic. It's surprising. I mean, I remember reading that on Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, the horses that survived the longest were the ones from Portugal, because they'd grown up half starved, so suddenly and not treated very well. So actually, this wasn't as bad as a shock to this big, much larger, more impressive heavy cavalry horse. Were dying like flies because they just needed just more. And it's that sort of
the practicality of what you have to have, what works,
Yeah.
I mean, there's Clydesdales and there's little tiny ponies. They all have things they do well and not do other well. The other thing I was wondering about is you said they get to go home and do a season or two or whatever it's going to be to take a break. How fast does information move? Okay, yes, galloping horse, but I mean, if you're in Britain and you're going to get orders from Rome and they're like, hey, we're going to send, I mean, how long does it take to get that message one way?
Several weeks for the journey. I mean, it's one of those interesting and really irritating bits of the sort of sources we have. There's a letter from the orator Cicero written in 54 BC where he talks about, I've just had a letter from my brother Quintus, who's with Julius Caesar in Britain. But moving on from that, he doesn't bother to tell you anything that's in the letter. But Caesar was only in Britain for less than half a year.
Right.
And even at that, it's an expedition. He's come for the second time. He doesn't go back afterwards. And yet the army's messenger postal service is working well enough that this has got to Rome in less than a month, even then. Right. So when things are more settled, when the roads are better, when the imperial post is organized, it's quick, but it's still, by modern standards, our technology, there's not even a telegraph or anything. You can send very basic signals from signal stations, but that's simple stuff. Anything complicated has to be written down or passed on verbally. So it is slow. And, you have cases in the later empire where people will rebel on a false rumor that the emperor's dead. So the local governor declares himself emperor, and then the news arrives, oops, sorry, he's not. So what do you do then? Because you can't really go back from that step. So you get hints of this. And Caesar talks about the peoples of Gaul yelling news to each other and always claims to be surprised at how fast information could be carried in some of these cultures. So very hard to tell. It's slower. You have to sort of think in a different time scale almost to how long everything would take.
The other thing I always think about it, and you tell me because I don't know, how often are we finding new things out? Finding a new archaeological site. Someone pulls an old chest of, holy cow! I got these papers that are, these things happen, right? We go into a cave and there's something remarkable in that cave, because a lot of the things we've written about, they had to have happened before, like the battle at Lake Trasimene. Okay, that's a very famous battle. We've studied it. We all know the tactics, but that came from somewhere. Maybe it came from Hannibal's genius, maybe, but probably that happened somewhere else and it's just not captured by history. Or maybe it was and he learned it and he said it. I don't know, but there have to be events that happen where they just haven't survived yet for history.
Well, it's one of the things that does survive for, Roman manuals for senior commanders is lots of examples. These are things that have worked in the past. This was a way of improving the morale of your men, of getting an advantage, getting a little edge in a battle. So they think very much in terms of, if somebody did this before, maybe it'll work for me. That's partly a fluke of these things have survived, other things haven't. So there's an element, the new stuff, you can't predict it. Vindolanda is a remarkable site. They found another about 50 tablets, I think it was, 2017. And again, what you seem to have are largely the bits that when a particular commanding officer of the post is about to move on, he does a clean out and you look through what am I going to take with me? What goes on the cart? What goes on the bonfire? Because a lot of them have been partially burnt. They're wooden, thin bits of wood, because that's cheaper than papyrus. But it's so thin that as the fire heats up, you can end up lifting them off the fire and then they survive. One of the lot they found in 2017 was in a row, and the speculation is that a man was carrying, say, a basket or a bucket full of these things with a hole in it, and they just fell out and nobody could be bothered to pick them up. Yeah. You need a site with the right conditions for things like that wood to survive. And Vindolanda is remarkable because I've been there when they've pulled out a piece of leather tent, sort of a couple of feet square, and it's still supple.
Wow.
This is calfskin, and that's dating to the early 3rd century in that case. Right. So they pull these things out. They've found more shoes there, leather shoes, than anywhere else in the empire. I think it was over 5,000 the last time they counted it, to the point where I remember the head of excavations one day was there complaining because they'd found 80 shoes that morning, which, on most archaeological sites, that's the find of a lifetime. Yeah. But it's more of the, where do we store these? How do we conserve them? Yeah. One of the interesting things with the shoes is that, this is an army base. Yes, there are some expensive stuff that's owned by the commander, his wife, his family. But a lot of these, you can tell that unlike the Middle Ages, even an ordinary soldier's got several pairs. He's got service boots. He's got a sort of more lighter indoor pair. He's got slippers for the bathhouse. So at least 3 pairs at any one time. Whereas, say, in the Middle Ages, you basically have your pair of boots and you wear them until they fall apart. Then you get another set. And the other interesting thing is that over a period of maybe 10 years, fashions for both men and women in shoes change empire-wide.
Wow.
So they've got enough sense of what people are doing in Syria and Rome and Spain up there that even, and this is very much fringes of the, this is really the northern edge of the Roman Empire, and yet it's still plugged into this bigger system. You can get almost any sort of goods there. You might have to wait a bit, but it'll get there if you wanted. So it's isolated in one way, but it's also weirdly connected to everything else as well. Relatively fast. It's not the speed of the modern world, but it's compared to anything else that you'd had for a long time before, especially in Europe, and that you'd have in Europe again. It's going to take another more than 1,000 years before you get back to that sort of society and that sort of economy. In some cases, not really to the 18th century. So, there is something very different about the Roman period.
Yeah, what is it about the Romans that we hold on to so dearly, that we're so fascinated by? Because, okay, look, we know a lot about the Greeks, but let's be honest, not that much. Like person to person. The Sumerians, nearly nothing. I couldn't talk to you for 1 minute intelligently about the Sumerians. The Persians, the Chinese again. How about the Chinese after that? All these different areas. And it's also interesting, too, when I think about, like, America, and we're such assholes to one another. We talk about white people, and we would want to lump, you're white, I'm white, a German guy's white, a Romanian guy is white, a Greek guy is white, all completely dramatically different people with different cultures, different beliefs, but it's really easy to lump them all together. Have we gotten any better at this, or have we always done this kind of thing where we just lump people together?
I think we always have. The Roman genius, and it is unique really in history, is that they didn't just conquer an empire, they did make so much of that empire Roman. Because it is strange, the people at Vindolanda, as I say, hardly any of them had ever been anywhere near Italy. But they are Roman as far as, because even the ordinary, the private soldier in an auxiliary unit does his 25 years, he's made a Roman citizen and he gets the full legal rights. He might not have that much money, but this is status. And he's been in an environment where Latin is the language of command, of communication, where, yes, you can tell, those with the linguistic skill can see there's an influence of some of the Celtic languages on the Latin they're writing, and probably even more speaking there, but it's still very recognizably Latin. It's almost the melting pot, but you're exporting it. Whereas the great success of America more than anywhere else is to bring lots of people from different cultures and make them American. The Romans, unlike other empires, go out and they do that to people on the spot. And they have a long time to do it. Britain is one of the last provinces conquered, and they're still here for 360 years. So by the end of it, no one can really remember a time before Rome. And it's striking that when the empire does collapse in the 5th century, there aren't the sort of, there isn't the winds of change that you had in 20th century Asia and Africa when the empires were swept away. That sense of wanting independence, it just isn't there. Nobody wants to be British or Spanish or a Gaul because they can't remember.
Right.
What they really want is a Roman Empire that works for them and an emperor who looks after them and treats them well. And the empire isn't able to supply that anymore. It's been fighting itself for so long, it's just rotted away. But that's the dream. Civilization means Rome. And even the groups like the Franks and the Goths coming in, they really just want a piece of the action. They'd like that lifestyle. Yes, we'll be in charge. Yes, we'll have the nice villas and we'll have the luxuries. They're not trying to destroy it, and it collapses even though in a sense, almost everybody wants to preserve it, but you haven't got the economic basis, you haven't got the stability anymore. But it's existed so long that, other than, it's probably different in some Eastern cultures because they've been civilized when Italy was nothing. There's a deeper sense, and there are some, but even there, it's quite hard to remember a sense of identity. So it's that success, I think, is part of it. It's also, the Romans are this odd mixture in that they seem very modern. They've got glass in the windows, they've got central heating in their houses. And even though gladiatorial games, chariot racing, this sort of thing is rather shocking to us, the fact that Hollywood keeps coming back to it generation after generation, it's good box office. People, it's not real, but you're still watching these movies because it's exciting. But they're wealthy enough that they can devote all that effort and that money just to making their life more comfortable and entertainment. The bathhouse is probably the most sophisticated piece of engineering the Romans produce, to the extent where it's been quite hard when they've tried to reconstruct a bathhouse and get it working, actually to make it work. The one up at Wall's End on Hadrian's Wall, big problems with carbon monoxide poisoning. Now, presumably the Romans didn't all die every time they went to the bath. So there's something they knew, which we can't work out. Nobody wrote down. We can't work out from the archaeology or even from sort of first principles how you do this. And all of that, all that money, all those resources, it's just to make life more pleasant. So they're very modern in that sense, even though, slavery is entirely natural to them. But it's different to the modern era, is that it's never been for them a racial thing. Anybody can be a slave, anybody can be a freedman, anybody can be a Roman citizen. So they have all sorts of snobberies and prejudices, but oddly enough, appearance and race is less there. It's still there, they're human. It's more about, the Greek idea, everyone who isn't Greek's a barbarian. They sound like sheep, just bleating because they can't talk properly, so they must be stupid, they must be inferior to us. So they have all sorts of prejudices of their own. And they're people, you get rebellions against the Roman Empire, but an awful lot of the violence that occurs is intercommunal. It's where you decide, Athens and Sparta riot and fight and kill each other in the 2nd century AD. This is hundreds and hundreds of years after the Peloponnesian War. You'd think it's almost like some of the hooligans at a football match or something. Yeah. It becomes, so they still divide. Exactly. It's, Jews and Samaritans and these other groups, when you get the rebellion against Nero and it's independent, but the first thing everybody does is turn on their neighbors. The Romans are a bit too distant. We'll get to them later, but so go ahead. No, I was just going to say, in a sense, there is a truth to the Roman peace in that most of these areas are more stable. They're not far from perfect. You've still got problems of banditry, crime, all these things, but at least somebody's trying to control it and has a bit more chance of succeeding, because not perhaps for any altruistic reason. It's simply they just want you quieter to pay your taxes and not cause trouble. But to achieve that, then they sense, we'd better do something about it.
I'm always curious about this aspect too of modern times and looking back at history as a mirror or a lens, I guess. We again, when it comes to race, because we're so bad at this stuff, at least here in America, but we want to deny someone to be from where they're from. So I live in California. It's all Indian land. But before that, it was some other Indian's land. And before that, and before that, before that. So we've always, throughout the world's history, we've always taken over land. And then at some point, you come from there. If I was to say, hey, Adrian and I are Caucasian, we're going to go to the Caucasus area and go get our birthright, they would laugh at us. We're not from here. You're not Georgian. You're not Azerbaijani. You guys are from Great Britain and the United States. Come on, get out of here. So you have to belong to somewhere. How did the Romans, or did they do a good job? I mean, I know the Greeks handled it a little bit different. Alexander handled it a little differently. But how do you, as a major society, allow people to belong to where they're from without stomping on somebody else's, fromness? I
mean, it's the ancient world, so I'm sure there's lots that's wrong about it, and there's lots of people resenting the new people who've been here only 200 years or whatever it might be. As you get today, the difference is this concept of citizenship. It is very different. I mean, I've tried to it's one of the things I play around with in the stories, in that I have Ferox, who's, because I live in South Wales, the tribe that was here was the Silures, who fought the Romans for about 20 odd years, inflicted some serious defeats on them. It's hilly country, it's not mountains, but it's rugged. And they were clearly awkward, but eventually they are suppressed, they give in, and the idea is he as a boy is sent to Rome, he's educated as a Roman, given citizenship, which is what they did very often, and then sent into the army, because it's partly a thought, well, he might be useful, but also there is this sense, wherever you go, you try and recruit the people you were just fighting so that you can use them to fight someone else, but also you give them a job, because in many of these areas where the ancient world isn't a peaceful place. So before you've got there, nearly everywhere has been fighting community against community for as long as everyone can remember, probably longer. Right. There is a reason people get buried with swords and things in Iron Age Britain. It isn't just for show or because this is a show, valuable weapon. Why they tend to build ramparts around even small settlements. Just, it's not going to stop a major attack, but it'll stop cattle rustlers, or at least make their life more difficult. So I've tried to play around with the idea of you've got this man who, in the one sense, thinks of himself as belonging to this tribe that's always been rather a predatory. They were known to be raiding the neighboring tribes for a long time afterwards. And I've embellished on that. Basically I've turned them into sort of Apaches, basically, because I grew up watching Westerns. I like Westerns. It's that sort of, and you can read about that. You get a sense of, so they're a cross between that and the sort of Pathans of the Northwest frontier, which doesn't quite work in this topography here, but it's near enough. It makes them different. The sense.
Can I jump in here and say something too? We just had Sebastian Younger on the show yesterday. I don't know Sebastian's work, but in his latest book called Freedom, he talks about the Apaches and their ability to move 70 miles in a day. Yeah, and women, children. If you were going to be with these, you had to move 40 miles, 50 miles, and nobody else in the region could do that because they were so well adapted to it. Their life, also was impacted by that. But this is a real thing where if you go follow that set of bandits around the wrong corner, that's called bandits kill you corner. Something, because they know that there's an ambush that can always, because they know this land so well, they know how to move and survive. They are from there, truly, Sorry, I had to say that because it was
no. Well, that's important. Yeah, well, that's the idea. That's why I have him. He's used to creeping around in the darkness, using the shadows, and even my modest sort of OTC stuff as a student, an awful lot of what we did was it was night patrolling, all this sort of stuff, and you learn a bit, not much in the brief. We were only students. We learned sort of that. That sense that this gives you an advantage. So he's fighting in a traditional way, but he's also a Roman, and he's not entirely happy about either side of it. I think scholars tend to be a little bit too simplistic. And it used to be, the idea was, when it was influenced still from the early 20th century onwards, when there were still all the European empires, and these were generally considered a good thing. So scholars thought the world, the Romans made the whole world Roman and everybody was happy about it. To the modern view, where empires must automatically be bad, and therefore everyone's just pretending, they're going through the motions, they don't really like it, they resent it. To the point where, people are looking at pottery types and saying this shows active resistance against the Roman Empire. No, it's a dinner plate. This is what you eat. This is what it's good for cooking. You use it that way. It's good, these sorts of things. So some of it is academics wanting to, they've already decided what the conclusions they want. So they go and reach them. I suspect it's complicated, but some of the interesting things are the Romans don't really care what you do at home, as long as you do follow some of the rules. But there is this, from early in Roman history, if you were a slave owned by a Roman and you were freed, you became a Roman citizen. And your children had full rights. You had a few sort of limitations on what you could do. Not many, but a few. Yeah. They have absolutely everything. So, even the Roman senators are saying by the late Republic and the early Empire that, look around this room, all of us are descended from slaves. And initially, the slaves you had were probably other Italians you'd been fighting, so they weren't so different. But as time goes on, it does mean that people of all sorts of different shapes, colors, were Roman. Yeah. And once you got that status, then you were recognized as part of that. So, but again, you could have your private life where you have to wonder, the aristocrats in Britain, for instance, don't seem to take to cities. The Romans want them to build a big house, live in the city, be a city magistrate, a city priest. the cities never quite grow here in the way they do in other parts of the empire, but they build these massive villas. So they do their own sort of version of Roman life. And there probably are still, I've hinted in some of these stories, you have in the fort, you've got the, Ferox's his wife is the queen of the Brigantes. The Romans haven't quite recognized her. A lot of these dynasties go on. A lot of these noble families go on. They're still the big landowners. They've managed to make the change. And in some cases, they're leaders of groups that allied with Rome from the start and saw they were onto a good thing, or were the ones that did, so therefore they've ended up. Flavius Cerealis, who's a real character based on the Vindolanda tablets, we'd never have dreamed him up till these tablets came along. And from his name, he's commanding a unit of Batavians. These are people from Holland. And in the aftermath of Nero's death, the big civil war that happens then, the Batavians rebel, first of all saying they're supporting an emperor, and then they're going to make the empire of the Gauls. And it's a really serious rebellion because at the heart, you've got 8 cohorts of some of your elite infantry of the Roman army who have this incredible reputation for fighting. And they've gone over completely, officers and everyone. So it's not just the men mutinied, everything there, they're still fighting as subtly as you are. Now, we always thought after that, the Batavians must have been, the Romans must have thought it's too dangerous to let these people be commanded by their own nobles as officers. And yet, the man who suppressed the rebellion was called Cerealis, and the emperor who won was Vespasian, who was a Flavius. So this man, or probably his father, has got the name Flavius Cerealis because they changed sides or backed the right side at the right moment.
Right.
And he's still commanding Batavians. And one letter, a decurion, a cavalry troop commander, refers to him as my king. So the odds are he's actually from the royal family of the tribe. So they are still keeping. So now, it's for a novelist, that's marvelous, and it's a big theme in some of the earlier stories. But so yet the Romans are using some of these relationships. They don't mind as long as it doesn't conflict with, you can still be prefect equestrian, you're doing things the Roman way. But the odds are there's a lot more of this going on. There are people who, for part of their life, can go off and do things the traditional way. Some groups, it's one of the big problems with the Jewish population of the empire is because they've developed after the Maccabees, these very strict rules about what you can eat, what you can do, sacrifices you can perform. There've been a lot of Jewish mercenary soldiers in the earlier period under the Persians, under the Hellenistic kingdoms. And again, it was that sort of safety valve. You took your young men who might think of banditry or rebelling if they can't get a job. You send them off to the army, you educate them, you pay them, you make them Roman. And if they're going to go and do anything unpleasant, they'll go and do it to people you don't like rather than you. Yes. That's one of the reasons for the problem, is that you can't do that with that population anymore. Because they won't join up, and they are formally exempted from service, which is seen as an honor, but it's also a bit of a problem. And for their aristocracy, one of the best ways the sort of the local elites from Britain, from Gaul, from Spain advance in the Roman system is volunteering to be army officers and being these because half the army are the auxiliaries. All of these units for the first couple of centuries are commanded by one of these equestrian officers. So you go through the stages where they sort of trust you, first of all, with an infantry unit, then maybe a mixed unit. You serve in the legions for it, then you get a cavalry unit. And if you get one of the really elite double strength ones, that's because you've been trusted, because this is something you don't want messed up. And even in terms of if there's not a war, if somebody doesn't look after the horses and doesn't manage that unit well, or at least allow the people who know what they're doing to keep doing what they're doing properly, then these are expensive assets that can go to ruin quite quickly. So there is this whole system, and the army is an important part of integrating people in, to the point where, by the 2nd century, you're getting emperors like Trajan, whose family has lived in Spain for generations. And Hadrian as well. You'll get Septimius Severus from North Africa, but they're Roman. And people might mock their provincial accent now and again, but basically it's very minor. There is a sense that. But it doesn't last even with the Romans, in that for a long time, if you're a Roman citizen, you can't be crucified, you can't be subject to lots of humiliating punishments. You tend to get a better deal from the law, and you have more rights.
Yeah.
By the end of the 2nd into the 3rd century, they start dividing citizens up into the humiliores, the sort of more humble men, and the honestiores, the more honorable. And suddenly it starts that citizenship doesn't quite count as much as it used to. So your status goes, which means all these people who've served through the army and worked for it, their children and their descendants aren't getting quite the rights as before. And the empire, it's another of the reasons for this contribution, it becomes less stable. So,
Right.
human beings have a incredible talent for doing some really remarkable and gifted things, but they also have such a talent for messing up. That they each might, each culture might do it in its own way, but so the Romans, they're not. It isn't coincidence that the Romans have this big empire for so long. They're getting a lot that is certainly, whether it's morally right or wrong, it's effective. It works. Right. And most people are much happier being Roman and being in the empire than they are rebelling. But it doesn't last forever. Nothing lasts forever. It's that sort of sense where bits of it start to decay and then it all falls apart eventually. But it takes a long time. It's so strong.
Yeah, it is. And I think there's all kinds of remnants today. I wanted to ask, what's the neatest or most interesting thing about the Roman times that most people don't know? Like, what would you want to give us all? Like, this is something you couldn't imagine. Like, I know they did brain surgery. Okay, great. But like, what's something like that just blows you away when you think about it?
Oh, there's so much. And it's often, I mean, funnily enough, the things that often you find most pleasing as a historian, when you discover something and think, actually, that's pretty much as we do it today. And there are, one of the things, again, from Vindolanda, coming back to the shoe thieves, they found shoes of the commanding officer's children. And it's just like any parent, how quickly they're throwing these away because the kids have grown and you've got to get newer. It's those sort of ordinary little things that fascinate. But I mean, the thing that apart from the fact we're, next month's July after Julius Caesar, August after Augustus, we never really think of it. But another thing that people never think about, we'll get to December. Now, December obviously means you don't need much Latin, 10th month.
Yeah.
But it's the 12th.
Right.
Because before Caesar introduced the calendar, there were only 10 named months. And when he introduced it with 12, things still had to happen. The year had to start in January and had to finish in December. So you put 2 in the middle. Yeah. But when you move from and yet we're still doing this, and we don't think about October, the 8th, you never, it's so automatic. And there's a lot of Roman things that are still there beneath the way that we do things, beneath the way we think, the language, that, even for Britain or America, where we've got legal systems that aren't primarily based on Latin law, so much has still filtered in of the way we do things. So I think a friend put it best when we were students studying this, is that, the Romans weren't always nice, but studying them, they're never boring. So there's loads of good stories. There's lots of things you just come back to and you read and think, wow, it's still interesting. There's just that. So I think that maybe rather than anything specific, it's
all these things though, right? Like when we here in America, when the president's like, I'm going to nominate a czar of something. Well, that's Caesar, and Kaiser is Caesar.
Yeah.
And, it's just everywhere. And it's incredible. I saw the King Tut exhibition. It was here in the States for a while, and you can't invent a fork because somebody did that like a long time ago. Or the pen, they had a pen and a notepad behind, like by his bed for like a dream journal or whatever, and who knows if it was his or not, but it's Egyptian era. Like this is a notepad and a pen by a bed that's just a human experience. And you're right. So many of these things, they go across all time. It's neat. And then how about, not only if you're going to name 2 months after 2 different, leaders of Rome, you're going to make them the longest months of the year. You're not going to shortchange one of them. And then how about the days of the week all being, Greek or Roman? Are they all Roman gods? The days
no, well, you've got Thor Thursday. That's it. So and Tuesday, Friday. These are all so and Woden's Day, Wednesday. So that's where the Anglo-Saxons have come in and given us that, and we don't think about it. And it's
right.
I sort of always think when people get worked up about using BCE instead of BC and all this sort of thing, I think, well, have you ever looked at the days of the week and thought about those? If you want to take offense, you will, but it's the same system. Why, you don't need to be sacrificing things to Odin just by saying it's Wednesday today. It's this, it's just.
It's I want to say one too on our end, like when we start getting mad about things named, or we hate Columbus and we yank statues down. And I'm not defending Christopher Columbus, but the capital of our nation, the full name, if you're going to say this, Washington, slave owner, D.C. for Christopher Columbus, and the United States of America, an Italian explorer. I mean, it's like, what are we going to do? Like, you can't.
Exactly. It's and as you say, how far back do you take it? It's I'm living in Wales. The word Welsh comes from the Anglo-Saxon word for foreigner. These were the ancient Britons who get sort of pushed out and survive on the fringes. But it's a long time ago, and many of those peoples had come and had subdued other tribes. It's one of those things. Sometimes, again, that there's a big problem within the academic community because the natural reaction now: empires are terrible, the Romans are conquerors, therefore the Romans are terrible. But look at the people who were here before, because most of those are also empires, just as smaller. They're less successful. The Romans are basically the biggest, toughest predator on the block, and the most successful at building something afterwards. Not saying they're nice, because they're not very often, but more people have a higher standard of living then than they did before, and than they did for a long time afterwards. So history isn't simple, and there aren't there haven't been that many saints and absolute, utterly evil monsters in history that we can just categorize people accordingly, let alone groups. You start going down that pathway, and it's not a healthy one.
Yeah, let folks be folks. Hey, everybody, go get The Fort, Adrian Goldsworthy's book. And actually, if you're into history, just go to his website, adriangoldsworthy.com. There's tons of great stuff there. Obviously, listen to hear the guy talk all day long, and your big brain. I just love it, man. I love that we get to kind of just throw these conversations together. It means a lot to me. Anything in closing?
No, I've probably talked more history than I have about the novel this evening, but it's always difficult. You don't want to give the plot away, but
exactly.
I write the sort of novel really good. I love to read, so I think it's good. That's it.
All right.
Sorry, the one thing I'm proudest of is that I don't like any stories that are set and where you've got lots of military characters where nobody's got a sense of humor. So part of the idea in these and all the other books is that these people laugh. That the humor might not be subtle, it might not be always that nice, but it's there because you're dealing with terrible situations, and that's what people do. So as far as I'm concerned, and there are hints of it in the sources, the Romans were just like people today. So I'm very proud of my bad jokes in these stories, even if
it's
they
great.
don't make anyone else laugh. They make me smile.
I have laughed out loud, belly laughed during a firefight, so it happens. All right, stand by.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so